true or a false. But there are situations that you would also like to cater for null values. For example, if you are working with a database and you have a table called customers, which has a column called birth date. Birth date can be nullable because not everyone wants to put in their birth date. In that case, if you want to map that table to a C# class, that's one of the cases where you use a nullable type. Let's see how nullable types work in action. So I define a datetime here, call it date and set it to null. See, we immediately got an error. Why? Because datetime is a value type and as a result cannot be set to null. We can solve that issue by using nullable. Nullable is a generic structure that is defined in the system namespace. So with that, now we can have a variable that can have either null or a valid datetime. We can rewrite this code and make it a little bit shorter. The shorthand of defining nullables is to type the value type and then append a question mark. Now let's take a closer look at the members of a nullable type. Here are the properties and methods of the nullable type. GetValue or default, hasValue, and value are three members that you'll be using all the time. Let me show you the difference. It's best to show them by an example. So I'm going to put them on the console. Date, getValue or default, date, hasValue, and date.value. Actually, I would like to add a label here. So getValue or default plus, and here I output hasValue. So it's clear what value each line is representing. Oops. And here that would be value. Let's run the application and see what happens. We got an exception. The application crashed. Let's take a closer look. So here, getValue or default returns a value if the object has been initialized with an actual value, or returns the default value for that data type if it's null. In this case, because we set our date to null, it's trying to return the default value for a datetime, which is day 1 of month 1 of year 1. If you define a nullable bool, this method would return false if you forget to initialize it. HasValue returns true if the object has a value, but if it's null, it returns false. In this case, because it's null, it's returning false. But look at the last one here. When we access the value property, we got an exception. And that exception is of type invalid operation exception. It's saying nullable object must have a value. So basically the lesson here is when you access the value property, you should make sure that your object has a value. Otherwise, you're going to get an exception. That's why we have this method here. So this is the preferred way of getting the value. This way, if the object has a value, you'll get it. Otherwise, you'll get the default value for that value type instead of getting an exception. Now, let me show you something else about nullables. First, I clean up here. And I actually set the date value here. So new date time, let's say 2014, 1st of January. I define another date time. Let's call it date 2 and set this one here. See, we immediately got an error. Why? Because we're trying to put a nullable date time into a date time, and the compiler doesn't know how to respond to that. What if it's null? What should we do? The compiler doesn't know. So in situations like that, if you get that error, what you need to do is access that getValue or default method. In that case, because we have a value here, that will go straight into this date 2. Let's verify that. There you go. All good. Now let's take a look at the other scenario. This time I define a nullable date time and try to put date 2 here. So in this case, you don't need to call this method or do any casting. A value type can easily be converted to a nullable type, as you see here. So let's display date3 get value or default. There you go. Now let me introduce you to an operator that is pretty useful when writing code. It's called null coalescing operator. So basically, let me clean this up here and maybe just set this to null. Let's say we would like to write a code like this. If date is not null, set date2 to date. Otherwise, sorry, this has to be date.getValue or default because of the reason I just explained. Otherwise, if date is null, we would like to give date2 some default date. Let's say datetime.today. So in that case, because my date here is null, this else will be executed, in which case we set today's date here. Let's verify that. Date2. So today is 20th of November 2014. Okay, let's get rid of that. Now we can rewrite this block here much shorter. Let me show you how it works. So here I say date, null coalescing operator, which is double question mark, and then date time.today. Basically how we read that is if date has a value, put it here. Otherwise, use this value. It's a little bit similar to the tertiary operator. Let me show you. You should have probably seen this. Date time, date3 is if date is not null, use date, otherwise use datetime.today. Sorry, that should be that get value or default because we are converting from a nullable datetime to a datetime. So this is the tertiary operator in case you haven't seen that before. So this is the condition, this is the if. If that is true, this will be executed until this colon. Otherwise, this will be executed. Now, null coalescing operator is even a shorter way of writing this code. So you put your variable on the left side. If it has a value, it goes here. Otherwise, if it's null, you use this value. Well, that's pretty much it about nullable types. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.